What we're going to do today is called crucifixion scene investigation. I'm going to break it down to make sure you understand exactly what happened on Good Friday, almost 2,000 years ago. Let's start off with the Passion of Jesus Christ. The prayer in Gethsemane, 9 p.m. to midnight. We've got about 3 hours. He goes to the house of Annas at 1 a.m., then goes to the home of Caiaphas. And that's about 2 to 5 a.m. where he was tried and beaten, the Sanhedrin meeting with some of the leaders. Then we have Pontius Pilate at 6 a.m. to Herod. He's returned to Pilate, caned and beaten by a company of soldiers, scourged prior to the execution, delivered to crucifixion, and he's put on the cross at 9 a.m. and he dies by 3. And do you remember what was the reaction of Pontius Pilate and the others? Well, he died rather quickly. 6 hours, is that all? Some people actually hung on the cross for a couple of days or longer. Let's take a look at how this is said. His sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground, okay? Okay, now some people would probably read that and say, well, it meant he was sweating profusely. Doesn't necessarily mean that his sweat was bloody. I've heard all types of ways to explain this because, of course, we have to find some way to discount any potential miracle. So the question becomes, was it a miracle or was it just phenomenally, historically accurate documentation? Look at this. Hematidrosis, it literally means bloody sweat. 32 cases were psychogenic. In other words, the stress, the anguish, the fear was so great, these persons actually sweated blood. Fear of death by shipwreck and impending execution, typically the day prior to being executed, these people were in such fear, they bled as they sweat. The skin becomes hypersensitive. The miracle of Jesus isn't his divinity. The miracle of Jesus is his humanity. This is a replica of a flagrum that might have been used. It's got lead weights on it. These we might use fishing weights or that sort of thing, but the Romans had these types of materials. They would make these beads or dumbbell-shaped pieces that would hang on the end of the leather. The only thing I would say, the leather straps here are probably a little too flimsy, but then they would also put shards of glass or metal, animal bones, teeth in these so that they would catch on to the flesh and pull back. So what happens in this case is that the hemorrhaging, now keep in mind, this process has gone on through the night. We can assume that Jesus was not offered some soft drinks and kept comfortable through this. So he is already dehydrating. He's had the hematidrosis where he sweated blood, so he's lost a lot of body fluid already. He goes through this, and as you can see here, you see small bones, metal balls, leather thongs. This thing was made to be very painful. It's phenomenal how much damage was done over the shoulders, and you will even see on the front image how it sometimes wraps around, because typically, as you see here, the Roman soldiers are hitting from the side. There might be 2 soldiers, or maybe they're over here, and then they step to this side and deliver from the opposite side. If you take a close look, the flogging, the scourging goes all the way down to the ankles, the calves, the back of the legs, everything. So it was quite a beating, quite a bloodletting, even before he goes to Calvary. And of course, Isaiah, when we talk about fulfillment of the scripture, offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. And of course, we know he was mocked and spit upon. Crown of thorns. And I think it's important to tell you that we, from the research, don't believe that a crown of thorns was fabricated. You're going to stick yourself pretty good just trying to do that. Basically, they probably went to this bush, which is very prevalent in that area, and gathered together. There's evidence that blood is coming from the top of the scalp as well as around. the wood of the cross is extremely painful. You're trying to pull in air, and your skin is rubbing over this, and splinters, and it's horrendous. Every part of this is extremely painful, extremely difficult. Now this we have here, 70 pounds. Estimates are anywhere from, depending on what type of wood and the length of the crossbeam, usually they were 5 to 6 feet long, 65 up to about 105 pounds. Crucifixion occurred in a conspicuous location. Of course it did. The Romans wanted the other Jews to see, if you cause trouble, this is what we need to do. This is Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? You make it visible, you put them up there in certain ways, you change the position, you do some pretty horrible things that will catch people's attention and keep them talking about it. Now, when it comes time to actually carry the cross, you have the stipes, which is the vertical component, the patibulum. If I got a lot of people I need to kill in a single day, we don't want to spend a lot of time putting them up on telephone pole height. Truth be told, most of these stipes were probably only about 6 feet off the ground. The individual has been beaten. He carries, or she carries, only the patibulum to the site where they will be nailed to the cross. Now, some people were tied to the cross, and some were tied and then nailed. And again, there comes these practical things of like, how much is someone going to fight you to go to this sort of death, right? So the patibulum has a little notch in it. You're carrying this through the streets, again, drawing as much attention as you can from the populace, because you want to make this clear, we're not going to tolerate that sort of behavior. Jesus goes through the crowd carrying just the crossbeam and gets there. Now he's nailed to just the crossbeam. Again, 5 feet, 6 feet, even up to 125 pounds there, 75 to 125, depending on what documents you read on this, but that's probably more realistic. Now think about this. You've taken a serious beating and now you're walking with that much weight tied to your arms. You fall. You are going to do a face plant on the street. This is a Russian artist rendition of what that might have looked. And you know, some of us had talked about it and said, he's probably pretty darn close. Some people, we do know, the nails were not driven through the tops of the feet, but the one archaeological evidence we have of Roman crucifixion, the nail was actually put through the heel, laterally into the stipes. All of this would be horribly, horribly painful. That calls for 2 nails, not 1. And the Romans recycled. See, this is one of the things we started talking about too, is that, you know, the stipes, the patibulum, they were reused. You're being hung on a cross that's probably covered with feces, blood, urine, and other body substances. And it's probably very likely, as we just said, that you're not that high off the ground, and the legs would be put into some flexion. And now you have this horrible decision of how are you going to pull a breath? Do you pull up? Do you push up? Do you pull up and push up? All the while you're fatiguing, wearing out. And the best example I can give people is if you've ever broken a bone, that lancinating, burning pain, and I'm sure something all of us have experienced is you hit the funny bone, that electrical shock. See, the Romans were really good at this. You put those nails where they're going to either cut through the nerve or at least rub against the nerve. That's where the median nerve is. But at the same time, guess what? It's so cleverly placed it doesn't cause a rupture of any of the arteries, so they don't bleed out real quick. Most art, we see that the nail is put in the palm, and that is quite possible. But 2 things have come up. People debate this. They say, well, you know, back then when they talked about the hand, they did not distinguish the wrist from the hand. So perhaps the nail was actually put through the wrist. But just because of the way our hands are made, if you put a nail between these muscles and the tissue down here, the bones, it is quite possible that would rip free, but you can still put it in the wrist and angle it at such a way that you lock it into what we call the metacarpals, kind of the wrist bones, and that would allow for suspension. We have had pathologists over the years who have used cadavers to prove that sort of theory, that it can be done. And if each of you if you go like that and bend your hand, you see how that forms that groove. Now you just angle here and put the nail in. So it looks something like this. So it's angled a bit towards the wrist, even though it was actually placed in the palm. 5 to 7 inch nail. Take a look at that. See how the artery, you got the ulnar artery and the radial artery, they loop around, form that U shape there. So the blood continues to flow, but you are right near the median nerve, maybe transecting it. It would be very, very, very painful. We even get into a little bit of geometry. The Romans were phenomenal scientists. I would suggest, no, they just killed enough people this way that they found this is better than that. And ironically enough, you discover that that's probably the best angle to suspend someone with the upper extremities to make it as painful, intolerable, difficult to breathe as possible. So the individual's been hanging on the cross for 24 hours, or maybe 48 hours. And you know what? We got a lot more people that need to be killed. And they're able to push up and pull up, and they're lasting longer than expected. So eventually, one of these 4 would break the legs. So now the individual's hanging there and is no longer able to use the legs to push up and draw air. Okay. Now that we know did not happen in Jesus' case because he didn't last as long as they expected, right? And again, there's that photo. Now, what are the proposed causes of death? Pulmonary embolus, okay? So imagine that blood clot forms in the leg, floats up to the heart, gets pumped in the lung, you die of that blood clot going to the lung. Another one is cardiac rupture, where the heart basically gets damaged bad enough that when it pumps finally, it breaks and bleeds out. I'm going to go into a little more detail on that. Orthostasis, suspension trauma, asphyxiation, fatal stab wound from the spear, or shock. And we're going to cover each of those. So the broken heart hypothesis, this was presented as early as 1847, 1887, probably when spirituality was much more a common part of the healing profession, right? Think about this. We didn't have antibiotics back then. We didn't have, prayer often was what you might resort to as a doctor, as a nurse. And so 1847, 1887, could Jesus have had a heart attack? And with the contusions from the beatings, the fall, he goes down, maybe hits his chest. One of the considerations. Basically, this is speculative, and again, in the research that Dr. Joe Bergeron did and the other individuals, this doesn't seem so likely, as you can see there at the bottom. It would have happened much more rapidly, more likely. Suffocation. When we're talking about somebody on the Roman cross and pulling up to breathe, you see we say inhalation, normal breathing is active, passive in the crucified victim to inhale. Again, imagine the pain of that and drawing in, and one of the things that was often overlooked was the fact that you're going to collect fluid around those lungs. I mean, he took quite a beating even before he was put up there. And to go through this, and the fluid, we call that pleural effusion, that collects around the lungs. So less and less space, and you're fatiguing, and it's extremely painful, and it takes an incredible amount of effort to try to move air. Again, if Romans were really trying to save time, you'd think they might go ahead and just nail or suspend the arms and leave the legs dangling. But then you don't have a way to speed it up. You want to make this excruciating, you want to make it last.
Over time, as gravity pulls the body downward, the arms and chest become so stretched that they are hyperextended. This severely hinders the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, and the individual suffocates. In order to breathe, the individual could push themselves up into an elevated position to decrease the amount of stretching on the arms and chest. This, of course, would cause immense pain to the feet. Sometimes a footrest called a suppedaneum could be added to the cross. This gave the crucified a firm platform to push up on to breathe better. However, being able to breathe also meant they would live longer and extend their own suffering. Eventually, they will succumb to asphyxiation after several hours or even days, either from lack of a footrest or their legs being unable to hold them up from sheer exhaustion. Asphyxiation occurs when the body is pulled down so far that the breathing muscle seize up, stopping all exhalation. With the ability to exhale being stopped, they cannot breathe in oxygen, as there is too much carbon dioxide built up in the lungs and blood. With no oxygen available, they suffocate for a few minutes, and shortly after succumb to respiratory failure. Crucifixion was a method of execution in which the individual slowly suffocated. This happened when the breathing muscles were stretched to failure by the weight of their own body, all the while suffering from the painful wounds of being nailed to a cross. The Romans described the gruesome method of crucifixion as ex crucio, which is the word we know today as excruciating.
This is another interesting piece of the historical accuracy of the New Testament. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And you know, this was talked of as this miracle, right? Blood and water. And you can think of how much, interestingly enough, think of the symbolism of that. Turning water into wine, and wine representing the blood of Christ. Well, guess what? The research indicates, we can call it miraculous, but I think it's incredibly accurate what they're describing. Okay? So, was Jesus alive at the time of the spear chest wound? The spear tapped a pleural effusion. You see, again, not like we typically see in art where they're going up. This Roman soldier is almost walking face to face and driving the spear into Jesus' chest. So here's what gets very interesting, though, the fatal stab wound hypothesis. And we say, well, how can this bleed? If he's dead, how does he get stabbed with a spear? And in this case, I'm going to point it out up here, okay? Right side of the chest here, okay? Think about the fifth intercostal space, we believe. We always look at, trying to get the estimates on these things and how that would clip into the lung and then go to the heart. And here's what a pleural effusion might look like, some pleural fluid collecting around. Now this is where the individual's lying down and getting a CT scan. And as we're looking up from the bottom, okay, so you have the heart here, the heart is here, and then this is where the fluid is. But if you're upright on a cross, it collects down here, the spear goes in, so clear fluid and blood would come out. I remember this article in the Journal of American Medical Association. Clearly the evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before he was pierced with the sword. And now what's interesting about that, we talk about hypovolemic shock. Shock isn't like, shock is where we've lost enough fluids, we've lost enough blood, the heart's pounding, it can't perfuse or send enough blood to the organs, and things start to shut down. The pH in the blood starts to drop because we create lactic acid. We start getting an abnormal rhythm of the heart, and eventually this leads to death. What are the clues that Jesus died of shock? Well, sweating, blood loss, the pleural effusion, no fluid for quite some time, weak and fainting, and as I mentioned earlier, that's only 500 meters, that whole distance where he goes from one palace to another, confronting, being confronted by these individuals and then carrying the cross, and then of course he cried out in thirst in John 19, and this is where it gets real interesting. Eventually we got enough medical research to find that 25% of trauma hospital presentation, 4 to 6 times fold likelihood of fatality. You look at this stuff here, shock, tissue injury, hemorrhage, hypothermia, acidemia, which is, as I mentioned, the pH of the blood starts to go down because the tissues are starting to die off. And you get inflammation throughout the system. Why is that important? Notice clotting time is much less when you're at 35 degrees Celsius. Notice in Jerusalem during the first week of April, 8 to 14 Celsius is the average temperature. So all factors are leading to the fact that Jesus will bleed out even after death. This was actually published in the media as the, quote, unholy trinity, where bleeding, acidosis, and hypothermia led to coagulopathy. So the point is, even though he's dead, the spear wound makes certain of that, but the fluid and the blood that come out are just confirmation of something that we discovered 1900 years later. Okay. Cause of death, cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion.
Took the cross and carried it to Calvary. When all was lost, you made a way. You prayed for us and took the weight of all we done, and oh, you are the reason we can say it is done. It is done by your blood. It is done. You have overcome the world. Your word is true. It shall not come back void to you. When all every sickness, every weakness, every fear and doubt and shame, every burden, every hurt is overcome in Jesus' name. Oh, every sickness, every weakness, every fear and doubt and shame, every burden, every hurt is overcome. Jesus' name. Every sickness, every weakness, oh, doubt and shame, every burden, every hurt is overcome. Jesus' it is done by your blood. You have overcome the world. It is done by blood. It is done by blood of your you have overcome. It is done. It is done by your blood.